so warmly. It's a real pleasure for me to be talking to such a well-read and I suspect very well-travelled audience. Now, many of you, I imagine, know Sri Lanka well, and some of you will have been here. Can I just have a rough idea of who's been to Sri Lanka with a little show of hands? Yeah, quite a few of you. All right, I'm going to test you now. There's a little prize here for the person, a little book, the person who determined the population of Sri Lanka. Probably Sri Lankans might want to hold back from this one. Who determined the population of Sri Lanka?
15.
8. 50. Who's 15? 15. Anyone else?
16.
22. Yeah, it's actually 21. But anyway, can I leave it to you to argue the toss on that one? That's an early book fine called Theatrification, set in Canada. Anyway, what I want to say on behalf of us outsiders is that I can be confident of this, that all of us in relation to Sri Lanka are struggling for meaning. As one United Nations diplomat put it at the end of his time in Sri Lanka, he said, the longer that you're in Sri Lanka, the less you understand it. And I wish I'd known that when I first thought about this journey back in 2009, because at that stage, Sri Lanka had a full-scale civil war up one end and a luxury tourist industry down the other. And it'd been a very odd war. At one point, peacekeepers appeared from India and ended up being shot by both sides. And then on another occasion, 2006, 5,000 guerrillas or cadres or terrorists, whatever you want to call them, changed sides almost overnight. And then, in circumstances that still no one truly understands, it ended Asia's longest ever civil war. So what did it feel like, I thought, after 26 years of fighting? Was this still the paradise described by other writers and earlier generations of writers? And how did it come to this? Well, by 2030, and it's an island that's almost completely rimmed in beaches, creating this gorgeous sprawl of lagoons and gobs. There's only one natural harbour, and that's Trinco, and it's probably the best in the world. Now, although Sri Lanka is only the size of Ireland, or Tasmania, if that's easier for you to envisage, although it's only the size of Ireland, it rises to a height of 2,500 metres. So think in terms of sort of French ski resort. And when weather systems coming across the Indian Ocean hit this great mass of rock, they burst, creating a land that's both Africa dry and fabulously lush. And then from these mountains come these fantastical rivers that pour down through a landscape that is so green it seems almost to glow with its own internal light. Now, for humans, this island is covered in food, and to the wildlife that lives there, it's really an enormous salad. And it's home to a startling array of creatures. You find the greatest concentration of leopards in the world in Sri Lanka. And that's not to mention the crocodiles, fantastic collection of birds. You can also find the biggest creature that ever roamed the planet, the blue whale. That's still there in Sri Lanka. And of course, the world's largest land creature, the elephant. Now, if we just stick with the analogy of Ireland for a moment, just imagine one wild elephant wandering around the Irish Republic. A picture that cause absolute chaos, wouldn't it? Well, Sri Lanka has 7,500. Now, of those 7,500 elephants, 70% of them are not in national parks. and only 168 are in captivity. So that means all the rest are on farmland or on government-owned forests or whatever. And that's this amazing sort of symbiosis, if you like, between Sri Lankans and their elephant. Somehow or other, they live together. It doesn't always work, but it's the most extraordinary relationship between man and beast. Now, it's not long before the mysterious ways of this country start crowding in. And I don't just mean boys in beards, as you see here. There's so much for an outsider to misunderstand. Caste, astrology, two languages, two main languages, Sinhala and Tamil, and the two alphabets, which to us look like beautiful sort of seashells, but are, of course, completely impenetrable. Now, most of the time, it's enough just to sit back and enjoy the parades that well up from nowhere, the street cricket, the monkeys on Gall-faced green dressed as little Europeans, the dancers in silver armour, and the elephants riding around in trucks. Now, foreign writers have been readily confused by Sri Lanka. This is one of my favourite quotes by Leonard Woolf. "I'm partially drunk with the complete unreality of it all and a very little whiskey. I feel as if I were playing the buffoon in a vast comic opera." That he wrote in 1904. But others have been equally bewitched. Mark Twain called by, the great American writer, and he thought Ceylon, as it was then called, was Asia taken to extremes. Chekhov also called by on his way from a penal colony in Siberia, and he thought Ceylon a sensual place, replete with opportunity. And then Pablo Neruda, the great Chilean writer, he was here as a diplomat in the 1920s, and he thought Ceylon lovely and sly. But life can be complicated too. Sri Lanka has one of the highest suicide rates in the world, and it's not about misery. It's more related to caste. Sri Lankans are the most charitable people in the world, giving away more per head than anyone else. And then there's the age of purity. This is a country where, for a short while, a film as innocuous as the Da Vinci Code was banned. And public displays of affection are frowned on, along with a conspicuous consumption of meat. Likewise, alcohol, bikinis, and dogs. Now, my journey began much closer to home, here in London. I live down in Wandsworth, very close to Tooting, and across London there are 110,000 Sri Lankan Tamils, a lot of them refugees, but not all. In my area, Tooting, there are 8,000 Sri Lankan Tamils. And it's worth thinking about that figure for a moment, because what that means is that there are more Sri Lankan Tamils in Tooting than there were ever Britons in Ceylon at the height of the empire. So in the 1911 census, there were about 6,000 Britons living in Sri Lanka, Ceylon as it then was, and now 8,000 Tamils in Tooting alone. And that's just Tooting. You add into that Mitcham, West Ham, Central Wembley, and all these other places, and you realise you're surrounded by these little centres of Sri Lanka all around us. And in my area, in Tooting, the Tamils who live there live in this very introspective world. They really don't need very much from London at all. They have their own clubs, their own charities, their own dance schools. They even have their own yellow pages, which gives a curious glimpse of London, coy, Asian, and jewelled. They even have their own internal crime wave, with gangs like the Jaffna Boys and the Tamil Posse, who go at each other with knives and swords, and London hardly seems to notice. There are 22 Sri Lankan Tamil temples across London. This is my local one here in Tooting. It's closed down now as the landlord repossessed it to turn it into more luxury flats. But most of the worshippers here were refugees. And they all come from a single town, or most of them come from a single town in Sri Lanka called Velveteeterai. So on the little maps, which I hope you will have, Belvedere Sri Lanka Kefale, I don't think it's marked right at the top of the island. It's about as far as you can go before you land in the sea. And it means Cotton Harbour. Many of the worshippers in this temple are very traumatised by the events of the last 30 years, 26 years. Very strong support for the Tamil Tigers, or LTTE, that's the separatist group, the most militant of the separatist group. And at this temple there was even a little shrine for the LTTE. So, as far as Colombo's media are concerned, my area, Tooting, is a sort of hotbed of insurgents and rebels. It's a sort of London's version of Mogadishu, if you like. Anyway, curious about my neighbours, I set off to find out more. And I would spend 3 months over these travels, and I would travel in any way I could, particularly in remote areas. Here I am travelling along in a tuk-tuk through an area of human-elephant conflict. Never a very comfortable experience when you think, if it breaks down, it's me and the elephants and the tuk-tuk driver, really. But I would also travel by bus, once by motorbike, and also in this rather wonky-looking ferry. And at one point, I even crossed the Jaffna Lagoon with some local fishermen. Now, for this seemingly innocuous journey, I had to get the permission of the regional naval commander. And that gives you some little idea of the complications of travel in a part of the world that's been so embedded in conflict for these 26 years. But best of all were the rail journeys. A perfect Victorian system still exists. And it still carries 88 million passengers a year. It's all there, ladies' waiting rooms, clocks made in Ludgate Circus. Riding through the Highlands in one of these trains is like riding along in a little Hornby train set. And during this journey I stayed in all sorts of places, including a Portuguese fort which is built out on a reef out at sea. Spooky place to stay, especially if it's only you and a couple of sailors there. I also slept in a tree. Now, this needs a little bit of explaining. What happened is I teamed up with a local rice farmer, and I asked him about the elephants and how he kept them off his rice. He said, well, what we do is we build these tree houses, or masa, these platforms up in the tree, and we go up there at night. And he said, come and join me. So off I went, and what Mahatoon's farmer does is he sings to the elephants. And the sound of human singing is very disturbing to elephants. They don't like it. So Mahatoon would sing through the night, and from way off in the trees, I could hear the other farmers in their tree houses singing back to us. And it was very eerie, in fact, rather beautiful. And he said, well, your turn. I'm afraid I'm not very good at singing. I don't really know the lyrics of anything. So I ended up singing Yellow Submarine. It was obviously very effective because we didn't see any elephants at all that night. But you might like to think what you would sing if you were determined to keep the elephants off your lunch. Now, throughout this journey, Sri Lankans were always impeccable hosts, and wherever I went, I was treated with the utmost kindness and curiosity. Only occasionally would that mask of serenity fall away and people would regale me with their rage. It's very easy to forget what people in this country have been through. But most of the time, people could be happily inscrutable. And outsiders often talk about that sad smile on the faces that give so little away. This man, by the way, was said about this country. I don't suppose that I shall ever again see such consistently lovely landscapes. Exquisite, both panorama and detail. Now, most of the pictures you're about to see, I took myself, but I have to say, this is probably one of my sometimes inscrutable. Sri Lankans can also be splendidly ebullient. And it's not unusual to see people dressed up in the costumes of 16th century Kandy. And that's no mean feat, because he's wearing a thick doublet, there's yards and yards, this is for the men, yards and yards of silk that form these sort of leggings. And there's pride too here, the tiny mountain kingdom of Kandy, which is actually only about the size of Cornwall, held out against the Europeans for 300 years. So to announce your Kandian heritage is to proclaim a certain superiority. Now, it's a curious feature of my travels in Sri Lanka that when I asked people about politics, or cricket, or whatever, people would very often say, well, look, I don't know, and they would hand me up the sort of social tree, if you like. So a simple question about cricket would find me being passed upwards until eventually I was chatting with Aravinda De Silva or Siddharth Wettimuni, great names in the world of Test cricket, even with relatively simple questions. It was the same in politics. If I wanted to ask something about politics, the next thing I knew, I would be passed over to MPs, until eventually I ended up going round to the House of former presidents and chatting to them. It made for very interesting interviews. And similarly with the army, I'd be passed up to brigadiers and generals. And this is one of the brigadiers that I came across. He's an engineer, and like all engineers, keener on construction than destruction. So what he's doing is he's building a peace park in what had been a Tamil Tiger landmine factory up in the north. And amongst his other exhibits, he somehow managed to get hold of a Route Master bus. I'm not quite sure how he's done that, but I love the idea of our London double-deckers doing their bit for the peace process in Sri Lanka. Now, I did promise I'd take you to a few places, and the first place that I want to take you to is the dry zone and the reservoirs of the medieval kings. Now, many of you who've been to Sri Lanka or lived there will be very familiar with Anuradhapura and Polonnaruwa. These were civilizations that evolved about 3,000 years ago. And it was a world known to the Romans. They had cities there of up to 1 million strong. And one of the dagobas, that's those great bell-shaped structures in Polonnaruwa, was calculated by some eminent Victorian explorer as containing enough bricks to completely rebuild the city of Northampton. These were once the largest buildings in the world after the pyramids at Giza in Egypt. And these cities had some of mankind's first hospitals, first public transport for the disabled, and first doctors for animals. But what people often overlook when they're going there is what to me is the greatest achievement of these cities, and that's hydrology. The reservoir kings, as I call them, these medieval kings, had this ability to channel water from the highlands of Sri Lanka into the dry zone and to make it bloom. This was a remarkable feat. These are channels made 40 feet wide, over hundreds of miles, falling perhaps only an inch a mile as they go. And between 500 BC and 1293 AD, they built over 18,000 of these tanks. And nobody really knows exactly how they did it. The channels, as I say, drop only half an inch a mile or so. There are bunds like this one, which these guys are standing on, sometimes built with 10-ton blocks of stone. And some of the tanks are up to 20 miles in circumference, like this one in this picture. And these reservoirs were so big that they would change the ecology of the island and also the climate. And in so doing, they would draw elephants out of the hills, so speeding the evolution of an animal that's really unique to Sri Lanka, a smaller forest creature, now perfectly adapted to life on the plains. But success and hydrology also created a pattern of destruction. Wealth attracted invaders, and with the invaders the engineering failed. There were floods and malaria, and pretty soon the cities of the dry zone collapsed, and they weren't discovered again for another 600 years. In fact, they were found by British Army officers in the 1820s and 30s. Imagine their surprise. Now the next place I want to take you is completely different. It's actually earlier in a sense. It's the last area where the original inhabitants of the island, they're called the Veda people. And they've hunted this island for up to 32,000 years. These days, there are only about 500 culturally discrete Veda left. And they can find a little area of forest. On your map, if you take a line between Kandy and the east coast, it pretty much bisects that line. It's called Gambana. And they're very curious people, really. They've got their own language, sort of onomatopoeic language of the forest. So, for example, a motorbike is a hootu-hootu. The English language is described as birds shouting, because that's how they think we sound. Now, traditionally, the Veda had no real use for names. They just called each other things like fat boy and oldie. They never farmed, they just hunt and forage for wild honey in the forest. And historically they had a great reputation for ferocity. They could also be trusted by the Kandians. And so whenever the Portuguese appeared, Veda could always be relied on to rain down arrows on their heads. But modern life, I'm afraid, has not favoured them. In the Civil War they lost all their guns. Now their king spends his time petitioning the United Nations, or bottling honey, or entertaining visitors, like me. Now this didn't really quite work out as planned, because what happened when I was there is the Veda put on a dancing display for me. It was a very spectacular event, 8 of them, just me, but for the first and only time during my travels in Sri Lanka, I was suddenly taken very ill. And I was urged to run off into the jungle where I was very colourfully sick. The Veda had never really experienced this reaction to their dancing before, and didn't quite know how to react. But so it made for a sort of slightly awkward start to our trip. The friendship was pretty soon back on form again. And this is my favourite hunter. His name is Sudu. And Sudu was very keen to make me one of the Veda bows. And they are huge things, sort of 5 feet long, like the old English long bow, very difficult to pull back. And I said, Sudu, I'd love to take one, but I simply can't get one on our aeroplane, they're too big. And he said, well, look, don't worry. And instead, he gave me two little snake charms. And the idea is these would ward off the poison snakes. So on my last day, I was sitting in my tent in Veda country, and 2 poison snakes came up to my tent, and when they got there, they then sort of wriggled away. So I thought, well, that's great. Sudu's charms are obviously working very well. And then Sudu himself appeared in the long grass, and he said, John, here, I've made you this little bow you can see here. He said, it's just the right size to go in one of your aeroplanes. So the next place I'm going to take you to is Jaffna. And for this you need to go to the top of your map, and this is the Tamil capital, if you like, or the capital of the Tamil world. It's a sort of mini Calcutta, or Bombay Light. A city of cupolas, gopurams, and bangaloos. This is the main street. It's called Foreigner Street, painted this amazing sort of buttercup yellow. And there's a bazaar here that blazes all night. And it sometimes seems as though you can buy anything here, as long as it's Indian. The city, of course, paid a very heavy price for revolt. It spent much of the 1990s under siege. And at one point, the LTT, or the Tamil Tigers, ordered everyone out. Not just everyone out of the city, but everyone out of the entire Jaffna Peninsula, and marched them south. And it's a city that even today, people are still very scarred by this event, amongst many others. And they have vivid memories of the city being left really empty, just a city of dogs. Anyway, Jaffna is, I'm happy to say, recovering, often through sheer ebullience. It sometimes seems the first thing to recover is the ice cream parlours. You can always get a good raspberry ripple in Jaffna. But this is something else that also shows recovery. This is the old
Norwegian monitoring mission headquarters. The Norwegians were here during the Civil War to try and keep the warring factions apart, negotiate a truce, a pretty thankless task, as you can imagine. And this is their building, which has now been turned into a very alluring boutique hotel. Other businesses too are thriving. Another of my favourites is a funeral parlour called Eason's. And Eason's have got this brand new building. They're building in the middle of a sort of bomb site, so surrounded by rubble, and there in the middle is Easton's funeral parlour. And at night it's got this neon sign, and all it says is, funerals, day or night service. It sometimes seems that the only things really survived unscathed from that period are these old British cars. You can find Hillmans, Austin, Cambridges, Somersets and Oxfords. And often, for much of the Civil War, these were the only cars that were available. And some of them still run on cooking oil. Apparently you need a little drop of thinners to get them going. This is a holy man who I met by the side of the road in Jaffna with his car. He told me that his job in life is to wash the bodies of the dead. And he explained that he was of a very low caste. And that really, this is his only possession in the world. An Austin A50. Now, for many years too, nobody was able to get out to the islands around Jaffna. You'll see islands in the world, and I wouldn't dispute that. Now, of these islands, probably my favourite is Delft, or as the Portuguese call it, the island of cows. It's about the size of the Isle of Wight, and you can still see traces of the Portuguese there. There's an old fort, for example, and lots of stone walls to keep all the cows in the right place. And there's this giant footprint which you can find in the limestone. Now, there's no restaurant on Delft, but there was a lady who cooked lunch for the local council. And you can find her house, she'll cook lunch for you. And the reason I show this picture is because of dawn. For those of you who've travelled in Zanzibar or Oman, you might recognise that style of architecture, that Omani Arab style, if you like. And it gives you some idea of the influences that were brought to bear in this part of the world over the centuries. Now, I'm going to digress very slightly now to tell you about a man who was here on Delft around about the time of the Napoleonic War. So between 1811 and 1824, Delft was run by an Irishman called Lieutenant Edward Nolan. Now, Nolan was supposed to be here for the Royal Navy, growing flax so that they could make their sails and so on. But, being a good Irishman, he was pretty soon breeding horses. And the stock that he was using were the horses that were left behind by the Portuguese. And they're still there. And they have something about them of the spirit of this archipelago, grand, disowned, and obstinately feral. And I love the idea that in these horses there's one last genetic link with the conquistadors. Anyway, Nolan was pretty soon breeding these horses, and he really ran Delft as his own private sultanate. His stables are still there, his residence is still there, and there came a point towards the end of his time when he'd become so powerful and influential, the local nobles ganged it up together, they complained to the authorities in Colombo, and a commission of inquiry was set up into the corruption of Nolan. And in true sort of British inquiry fashion, a panel of inquiry was set up on the next door island, and all the locals were called to give evidence at this inquiry, and on the basis of their evidence, Nolan was gloriously acquitted. He was said to have had skin as white as milk, and to have made love to all the local girls. So even today, they say, many Delftians still smile with Irish eyes. The next place I want to take you to is really the most difficult of all. It involves leaving that Jaffna Peninsula, that sort of piece that sticks out at the top of the country, and travelling through the isthmus, and in doing so, crossing a minefield that's 11 kilometres wide by a kilometre deep. And in this area alone, Halo, the mine clearing charity, have removed 153 anti-personnel mines. So again, it gives you some idea of the strength of this war. And beyond this area, we find ourselves in a very wild bit of country called Wani or Vanni. And it was here, between 2002 and 2006, that the Tamil Tigers really developed their own de facto state. And they built their own capital and their own bunkers and so on. They even built their own tanks, adapting them from tractors like this one. They mixed their own explosives. They even tried to build a submarine here. And the reason I show this picture is because it gives you some idea of the ambition of the LTT. A friend of mine who makes submarines tells me that they're very difficult to build. You've got to get the pressure exactly right. Otherwise, you put it in the water, as soon as the surrounding and the ambient water pressure is on it, the whole thing just implodes and crumbles up like a crisp bag. So the LTT thought they could do it. And it gives you some idea that this wasn't some sort of ragtail hillbilly outfit. These are people using computer-assisted design and great skill to build what they needed in pretty difficult circumstances. Anyway, as we all know, they eventually were forced out by the army, and as they left, they destroyed their own world. This is a water tower in Kilinochchi, which they blew up, it's fallen over, and it's kept like this today, as a sort of memorial to this dreadful time. Anyway, the end came here. So on your map, you'll see the Nanti Kadal Lagoon, right up in the northeast corner of the main bit of Sri Lanka. And what you'll see here is the lagoon in the foreground, and then across the horizon in this picture, a spur of land, and beyond that's the Indian Ocean. And it was really there on that spur of land, Mulai-Tivu, that the war ended. And for 4 years or so after the conflict ended in 2009, this whole area was out of bounds. But then when I was there, in about 2013, the army said that it was fine to go in there, and so with my army chaperone, off I went. Now, it's not easy to forget all that destruction. Really, for weeks afterwards, I would wake up, and the first thing I'd think about is some of the appalling destruction that I'd seen. This is a place where you can see cooking pots still scattered on the surface, or bits of sandbags. Sandbags very often made from valuable wedding saris that the civilians brought with them and cut up in order to make into these desperate sandbags. Or you can see a suitcase that's burst open, and even after 4 years in the sun, you can see these bleached clothes inside. What happened at Mulai-Tivu is controversial, and perhaps one day may be the subject of a full forensic inquiry. But what we can say is that here at Wanawakal, this is, perhaps you'll remember this, as some of the first TV pictures of the war, of people breaking out of this enclave of refugees and so on, and escaping across the water. A very, very poignant picture, looks very much the same today. Now, a little bit further along the shore, and this is marked on your map, is the wreck of the Farah 3. Now, just a little bit of background, the Farah 3 was a Jordanian freighter, which a few years earlier, in 2006, had been sailing from South Africa to India with a cargo of motorbikes and cement. It was captured by the LTT on the high sea. They pulled it onto this beach, and then they started stripping it down. So they took the steel off the sides to make into their tanks and so on, and then they used the bikes and the cement. And for a while, there was a glut of both things in their particular world. But then, on the last day of the war, or a few days before the end, on the 14th of May 2009, the last die-hard tigers crammed themselves inside this wreck. And to go inside the ship now is a curious experience. It's almost sort of symbolic of Sri Lanka itself in a way. It's a sort of leitmotif for what's happened, because you're on one of the most beautiful beaches. that it's possible to imagine. And yet you go inside this cathedral-like structure, and there's this sort of delicious sort of glugging sound of water as the sand and the beach has come into this vast chip. And then you look up into the superstructure, and you see it's absolutely riddled with bullets of all description, armour-piercing rounds and so on. And you just gives you some idea of the ferocity of that very last day of this conflict. And the wreckage of that time, I don't know whether it's been cleared up now, but it was sort of packed together like cake in some areas. There were 25,000 wrecked bicycles here and 10,000 burnt out motorbikes. And that's to say nothing about tractors and buses and all the other bits of kit that were left behind there. Now, no one was more grateful for the end of this war than the wildlife. This is a remarkable elephant. She trod on a landmine, and all sorts of attempts have been made by Sri Lankan vets to fit her with prosthesis. She's resisted all those attempts, and somehow or other, here we are all these years later, and she survived all of that. A remarkable beast. Elsewhere, animals didn't always suffer during the Civil War. As farming and national parks retreated, wilderness often re-established itself. And some animals did rather well out of the sort of peace, if I can put it that way, that the war brought. Just before leaving Sri Lanka, I came across this event. It's a victory parade in Colombo. And I had a curious feeling that nobody was really watching this except me. And there was a sense that Colombo had wearied of victory and soldiers. And here were Sri Lankans I'd never really seen them before. So women slung with guns, special forces in their leopard spot uniforms, rows of amputees wheeling past in their wheelchairs, and the Victorian and the top brass in their Victorian best, as if the last 100 years hadn't really happened. Meanwhile, ordinary Sri Lankans have paid a heavy price for what happened. 800,000 people displaced, 27,000 servicemen killed. Very often when you're travelling around Sri Lanka, many of you will remember this, you'll see these, they're bus stops. They've been painted up in the colours of the uniform of a deceased soldier or sailor or M by his family. And then there'll be a little portrait inside of the soldier. And I love the democracy of these monuments and the idea of waiting and a journey ahead. Meanwhile, back at the victory parade, it seemed that the soldiers too had wearied of war. And when they saw me at their victory parade, they very often called me over. I don't think any of them had ever seen anything that was sort of white and unwarlike. Anyway, these men hauled me up into their armoured car, and we exchanged photographs on our phones, and they talked about their farms and their fishing boats. And although we never had the common language to finish these stories, I got the sense of what they were saying. Or over to the west. There are dozens of them. And once they all had Dutch names, like Rotterdam and so on. There's only one left that still has its old Dutch name, and that's Delft. Replaced in part by these people, the UNP. Rather gratifyingly from my point of view, the symbol of the UNP is an elephant. Now, this is a UNP rally in Badulla in tea country. And what sort of puzzled me about this rally, and it still puzzles me about this photograph really, is that wherever the UNP marched through Badulla, they left this trail of shoes of all description. Why? How could anybody be so careless with their footwear? Oh well, it's just part of the mystery of this remarkable country. Meanwhile, back in London, the struggle continues. Tooting's Tamils. They still go marching under the LTT banner, and they still squabble about what happened to the LTT's money. And they argue that Prabhakaran, their leader, is still alive, despite all those pictures of him having been shot on the battlefield. And one of them said to me, "We pray for him every day." An ominous thought, perhaps. So, there it is, ladies and gentlemen, Elephant Complex. I'd expected the reaction from Sri Lanka and from media and audiences there to be more not dismissive of my book, this idea of a Brit, an outsider coming to their country, but the reviews were surprisingly forgiving, and so were the audiences when I went back there in February. And so perhaps Sri Lankans understand better than anyone else quite how complex life is in this beautiful island. And I hope you enjoy Sri Lanka too, in all its wonder and with all its oddities. As they say in Colombo, tikak pisu. It's all a bit crazy. Thank you.
They didn't actually go sort of stay in one area. They were dispersed throughout the UK and also in Canada, Australia,
yes,
and so on. And in fact, the newly independent African countries recruited professional Sri Lankan Tamils because George Alagaya was one of them. So there are two different aspects of Sri Lankan, expatriates as well. They're not all sort of, as you portrayed them, refugees struggling. We were all fairly highly skilled professionals.
Yes, and I mentioned this in the book, developing a section to what anyone might call the first wave of Tamils in this country, who tended to be, and I come across them as a lawyer a lot, either because they're doctors or lawyers, and they are very different from my neighbours, who came much later. My neighbours came in the 80s mostly, and they are, as I mentioned, they don't speak English, and they are relatively poor education and low caste.
Yeah, the Tamil people contributed a great deal to Ceylon as it was then.
Of course.
And it was the singular only policy that came in 1958, I think, with Bandar Naik caused these original divisions. Otherwise, we were all very peaceful together.
Yes, and I understand that the Tamils represent 40% of the civil service, an equivalent amount of the Sri Lankan army, and so on. So what you say is very important to understand. I'm trying to keep today's talk to my journey, to convey my journey.
Give the impression that it was all, refugees, struggling people, etc.
Yes.
Did you get a chance to meet other communities there, like the Burghers, and there is a section of Malays, etc. And of course the majority of Sinhalese.
Sinhalese.
Yes. Yes. And I don't know if whether Rajapaksa, Mahindra Rajapaksa was still in power when you were there. So there was a military and political sort of some, not tensions, but some kind of deals going on.
Of course not. Yeah, of course not. I've not. I try to keep politics simple for outsiders in this book. But yes, I certainly came across the different communities, particularly the Muslim community down the East Coast, and focusing from the point of view of my story in Batticaloa, which has, I think, a tragic problem of tension between the Tamil community and the Muslim community. There's almost like a Berlin Wall that runs through Batticaloa, made of corrugated iron. It's very fragrant. And I haven't realised quite what food it is Sri Lankans are. They will cross town for the best spices or best ice cream. They're as much food as the Parisians are. It's an extraordinary thing to witness. My favourite place to eat is right in the centre of Sri Lanka, a place called Golkadua Forest Lodge. And the lady who runs it has two cooks who go out into the forest every day.
When I was a journalist at the Financial Times to interview Arthur C. Clarke, who had relocated to Sri Lanka, and he told me it was paradise. In fact, they gave him an honorary citizenship at the time. My question is twofold. One, to do with Arthur C. Clarke and his having been welcomed. Did you come across a lot of expatriates there who felt, despite all the Civil War and troubles, that this was paradise and home for them, as Arthur C. Clarke did? And the second question was, did you encounter any recriminations? Apparently there had been any number post-2009 between the Tamils and the other side, if we can say.
Tamils and Sinhalese.
Exactly.
Yeah. Your first question is expats, effectively how do they get on there? The answer is very well, I think, and I think his experience was shared by very many Britons and Germans and other Europeans and Americans, for that matter, who've gone there. In fact, this has been institutionalised to some extent because the Sri Lankan government have brought out a programme that if you're of a certain age, you're allowed to retire to Sri Lanka with an amount of capital. And the offering is that the healthcare is pretty good in Sri Lanka. You get cheap domestic help and so on. You'll get a nice house, probably rather nicer than you'd have in Britain, nice climate and so on. So in a sense, there's a welcome there for older people in Sri Lanka anyway. If you want to become Sri Lankan, that's far more difficult. And I did meet what I call the last tea plant, is a man who's been there since 1945. And he's spent his life in the tea industry, and he's constantly petitioned the government for some sort of status enabling him to stay there, and he's never got it. He's been, it almost gets there, and then, no, the papers get lost or whatever. So actually giving citizenship or whatever to outsiders is a much more difficult issue. And it's not just political, it might actually have a spiritual dimension to it. This is an island that is for Sri Lankans. In its religious context it is. And the idea of outsiders becoming Sri Lankans is always a difficult one, I think. Your other question, recriminations against Sinhalese.
Yeah, on both sides post-2009, did you see any evidence of that or experience anything? Or did people talk to you about what was happening underneath the...
Yes, they did, but I would get the stories much more readily in London. That I would meet people in London who claimed to have been in the LTT, claimed to have been put in camps, tortured, escaped. One chap escaped to France, kicked out of France because they didn't accept him as an asylum seeker, came back to Sri Lanka, picked up at the airport by CID, tortured, he said. Now, I say he said, because you've got to be a bit careful about these stories, because many of them are true, possibly, but many of them are not true, because if you want to put together in a case as an asylum seeker, you can read these stories on the internet and put your own story together. So friends of mine who do immigration law say you have to proceed with caution with some of these stories, and I can well understand that that is the case. You've got to be careful about people who say this or that. As soon as I can, perhaps I'll talk about Guyana next time, which is the last book I wrote.
Guyana. Anybody from Guyana here? Because Guyana is a Commonwealth country. Nearer to that? Kenya, and John is from Bahama. Yes. So have you been to these countries?
I've been to them, yes, but I've not written about Kenya.
Okay. Now you've been to Pakistan.
I've been to Pakistan.
You had asked how many Pakistanis are here today. Can you put up your hands, Pakistanis? And somebody come because there were quite a lot of Pakistanis here, my friend. Mushtaq Lasharie, would you like to ask him a question or something?
I think he has answered beautifully, and my colleague Saundra Satterlee has asked you a question.
Sometimes I like, if I'm interviewing someone where what they say, exactly what they say is important, I like to record it. So not if I'm talking to a fisherman, but if it's a politician, I like to record it. Now that can cause difficulty, because you'd be chatting away quite happily, but as soon as a recorder appears, oh, no, that's a different story. People are very, very cautious, as you rightly say. So, yeah, I very much recognise that in that. Sorry, what's the second part of your question? It was?
No, I just wondered if you found the same. No, I'm just saying that you seem to have had an easy...
Yeah, I had an easy ride. One of the reasons I had a relatively easy ride is because I have a great Sri Lankan friend who was a commander in the Navy during the war. In fact, did 23 years service there. And he reached the rank of commander, and he has a lot of friends in the Sri Lankan Ministry of Defence. And he vouched for me that, and so I managed to get a letter saying that I would be okay, and that I should be allowed in to ask questions about various things. And I never abused that. I always let